A steel cell, copper walls, bone-chilling cold, and 20-kilogram shackles binding a single man. But on one winter night, a guard entered to inspect the cell and found the bed empty. The shackles were unlocked, and the prisoner had vanished. This was no ordinary escape. It was the beginning of a legend. His name, Yoshie Shiratori, and this man escaped 4 impossible prisons. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's start our story. In 1936, inside a Pashari prison in Japan, there was a prisoner named Yoshie Shiratori, a man accused of a crime he didn't commit, beaten until he confessed under torture. The prosecution sought his execution, and the guards treated him like an animal. Beatings, humiliation, and starvation every single night. In that cold cell, Yoshie learned his first lesson. The law doesn't protect the weak, only escape can save me. And so it all began. Shiratori was no ordinary person. On the morning of August 26th, at exactly 6 o'clock, he set his plan in motion. He had observed the guards daily, learning their routines, their moments of laziness, and their distractions. He had hidden a rusty wire in a water bucket where no one could see it. And on the night of August 26th, with the first ray of dawn, he retrieved the wire. His fingers were nearly frozen, but the lock began to give way. 1, 2, 3 doors. He was out of the building. But that didn't mean he was safe. The area surrounding the prison was heavily patrolled by guards, and alarms could sound at any moment. So he employed a simple trick to earn more time. He placed a piece of wood under his blanket and covered it with his futon to mimic the shape of his body. He even scattered some straw on the floor to make it seem as if he were asleep. It wasn't until the next day that they discovered the cell was empty. His freedom was short-lived. After just 3 days, the police arrested him while he was stealing tools from a hospital. He was returned to prison, and this time, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. But for Shiratori, walls were merely an illusion. After that, he was transferred to Akita prison, and there, the treatment was far worse than in the first prison. Beatings, torture, food deprivation, sleep deprivation. His reputation had arrived before him, and the guards in the new prison wanted one thing: to break the legend. They wanted to prove he wasn't special, that he was just another inmate who would eventually collapse. Then came the night of June 15. A violent storm was hitting the city of Akita. Wind, rain, thunder tearing through the darkness. Inside an isolation cell, Shiratori was locked up as usual. Just after midnight, one of the guards opened the small inspection hatch and looked inside the cell. There was no one there. The cell was empty. The guards were stunned. The cell was narrow, the ceiling high, the walls plated with copper, the manacles secure. Everything had been designed to prevent escape. Yet, Shiratori had overcome it all. According to the investigation, he had used a wire to pick the locks of his manacles, just as he had done in a Pashari prison. But no one could determine where he had obtained the wire this time. Perhaps he had concealed it during a brief outing from solitary confinement, or perhaps he had somehow found it within the cell itself. After freeing himself from the restraints, he would place his body between the narrow walls and climb upward, like a lizard scaling a steep surface. Each night, at a specific time, would silently ascend toward a small ventilation opening in the ceiling. The grill covering it was initially sealed shut, but Shiratori had noticed that the wooden frame around it had rotted. Night after night, he would work it loose. Bit by bit, then returned to his place and put the manacles back on, as if nothing had happened. After months of repetition, the grill was ready to be removed. But he didn't escape immediately. He waited for a storm, and finally, it arrived. On the night of June 15th, using the cover of thunder and rain, he opened the grill, climbed out, and escaped from Akita prison. He had escaped again. He had escaped from a place deemed inescapable. This time, however, he didn't go go far. Instead, he went to the home of the chief guard, Kobayashi. Chief guard Kobayashi was at home when he heard a knock at the door. He opened it and froze. Standing before him was none other than Shiratori, in torn clothes, exhausted, his eyes weary from weeks without sleep. Kobayashi invited him inside, offered him food, and sat down to listen. Shiratori said in a broken voice, "I didn't escape because I fear prison. I escaped from the torture. I was wronged, forced to confess to a crime I didn't commit. I don't mind returning, but I want to expose the corruption inside. I want to file a lawsuit against those who tortured me. I want people to know my story. Perhaps then I can return to my wife and daughter." This isn't an escape. It's the only path to justice. It was an elaborate plan to turn himself involuntarily, supported by the testimony of the guard who had treated him humanely. But while Shiratori was in the bathroom, Kobayashi picked up the phone and called the police. His trust had been betrayed. The plan had failed. They returned him to his cell. The lesson was harsh. Trust no one. Due to his second escape attempt, 3 more years were added to his life sentence. And though he had requested, at the very least, a transfer to a prison in Tokyo to escape the severe cold of the north, his plea was denied. There was no room for mercy. Instead, the authorities decided to send him to the most dangerous prison in Japan, a Bachuri prison in Hokkaido, a prison from which no one escapes, not because of the guards, but because the cold is enough to kill a person before they even reach the outer wall. Food would freeze before it reached a prisoner's mouth, and Shiratori was placed in his cell wearing only summer clothes. His body began to break down. He didn't even have the energy to crawl. In a moment of despair and fury, he stood and shouted at the guards, "I swear I will escape again, and you will not be able to stop me." They laughed at him, but he continued defiantly, "You think these shackles can hold me? They are a child's toy to me." Then right before their eyes, he stretched out his arms and snapped the chain. The guards recoiled. They couldn't imagine a man on the verge of collapse possessing such strength. But that moment was a grave mistake, for now they knew this man was capable of the unimaginable. The very next day, they began constructing a special cell, a cell from which no one could possibly escape. The new cell they built for Shiratori was unlike any other. It was designed specifically for him. Its walls were made of thick, non-corrosive steel, with every opening smaller than a human head. The guards bound him with manacles of a unique design. They had no locks, no keys. Their weight alone was 20 kilograms, and they could only be removed by a specialized team. They came every few weeks, a process that took them 2 hours. His food, he received only half rations, left at the door through a small slot. He had to crawl to reach it like a dog. The perpetual restraint of his arms behind his back left him nearly immobile. Even sleep was painful. He wore summer clothes while ice filled the cell, the cold gnawing at his emaciated body day after day. In the eyes of the guards, this man had to be broken completely, erased. Months passed, and the situation remained unchanged until the night that transformed Shiratori's story into a legend. On one of the early spring nights, an employee heard an unfamiliar sound from the upper floor. He went to inspect the cells, and when he reached Shiratori's, he froze in place. The bed was empty. The heavy manacles were unlocked, and neatly arranged beside the cot, Shiratori had vanished. The employee ran to sound the alarm, and a massive search began throughout the prison and its surroundings. But there was no trace of him. He had evaporated, disappeared. But how? How did he manage to escape under such lethal conditions? The plan for this escape had begun 6 months earlier. Shiratori, despite the hunger, restraints, and the cold, had one thing: time. He would save a small portion of his food, especially his soup, and daily sprinkled onto his manacles and the iron window frame. The goal, the salt. It slowly corroded the iron joints. After many weeks, rust began to appear. The iron weakened, the frame began to disintegrate. But he didn't stop there. Shiratori Shiratori possessed extraordinary physical flexibility, the kind of physique that can contort itself and pass through the narrowest of openings, like a circus performer. As the frame corroded, he began pushing his head through, day after day, until finally came the day he could squeeze his entire body out. And so he became the first prisoner ever to escape from a bashery, Japan's most fortified prison. For escaping the cell was one thing, surviving the winter hell of Hokkaido was another. In that part of Japan, the cold alone was enough to kill a man. Snow covered everything. Even the guards themselves had said, if he doesn't freeze to death, the bears will get him. Outside, his wife followed the news, her heart knowing no peace. She knew her husband was alive, but she also knew he had nowhere to hide. She hoped, amidst the world war raging around them, that Japan would collapse and lose control so that her husband might survive. But Shiratori was not finished yet. In August 1945, his wife's wish came true. America had taken control of Japan, and the Second World War had ended. The prison system was reformed, and certain cases were treated with more leniency. The search for Shiratori was no longer a priority, but the question remained, where was he, and was he even still alive? The answer, yes, he was alive, but completely isolated from the world. He had imprisoned himself. He hid in an abandoned mine shaft on a mountainside in Hokkaido and began a primitive existence. He survived on wild fruits and hunted rabbits and raccoons. He adopted and he survived. 2 years passed without him speaking to another human being. But eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He came down from the mountain and headed to the nearest village, where he was stunned. Everything had changed. Signs were in English. The symbols of war had vanished, and Japanese girls were holding hands with American soldiers. What was happening? He picked up a newspaper from the ground and read about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had surrendered a full year ago. He felt he had wasted 2 years of his life for nothing. He immediately decided to end his life of isolation. He began moving south on foot for 50 days until he reached the city of Sapporo, but hunger defeated him. He entered a tomato farm to get something to eat, but the farmer saw him and mistook him for a known thief. An argument broke out, a struggle, and a knife stab ended the farmer's life. It wasn't his intention to kill, but it happened. He was arrested and sent back to prison, but this time on a charge of murder. The guards didn't trust him. They watched him 24 hours a day, especially during his showers. They were certain that if he tried to escape, it would be through the roof or the walls, as he had done before. And Shiratori, he let them think just that. He deliberately repeated his wall climbing antics, keeping them focused on monitoring the upper areas. Meanwhile, he was working from below. He pried up the wooden floorboards beneath his bed and, using his food bowl, began to dig. For an entire month, he worked in silence. Every night, after digging, he would replace the boards and lay down on top of them. He pretended to be exhausted and despairing. He even convinced them he no longer responded to orders because he had given up. Then one night, the guards entered his cell, angry. They pulled back the covers to wake him and found nothing. The bed was empty. The shackles lay cast aside. An open hole, tunnel, and Shiratori, he was gone. He had escaped for the 4th time. And the ironic part, this had been his easiest escape ever. By 1948, Shiratori was approaching 40. The weariness was evident on him. An escape was no longer the simple game of his youth. In a Katoni district of Sapporo, he sat on a wooden bench in the street, catching his breath. A police officer passed by and sat down next to him. He had no idea who the man beside him was. Shiratori tried to speak calmly, to appear normal, to hide what was inside. But then the officer made a simple gesture. He opened a pack of cigarettes and offered him one. A moment of silence hung in the air. In Japan at that time, cigarettes were an expensive luxury, a rarity. Yet the officer, a complete stranger, offered him one without hesitation. At that moment, something broke inside Shiratori. His eyes welled up with tears, not from the smoke, but from the memories. He remembered Kabayashi, the chief guard at Akita prison, the only man who had treated him kindly, and who had then betrayed him. And here was this officer, treating him with humanity without even knowing who he was. The gesture was more than he could bear. In a quiet voice, he said to the officer, "My name is Yoshie Shiratori. I escaped from Sapporo prison last year, and I have escaped from 3 prisons before that." The officer was stunned, but Shiratori finally felt a sense of relief. He turned himself in of his own free will. This time, however, things were different. Japan was changing, and so was its judicial system. The High Court in Sapporo reviewed his case anew. They acknowledged that the farmer's death had occurred in self-defense, that none of his previous escape attempts had harmed anyone, and that his escapes were driven solely by a desire to flee torture and an unjust execution. The verdict, the death sentence, was commuted and replaced with a 20-year prison term. For the first time, they agreed to transfer him to a warmer prison in Tokyo. The guards there treated him with kindness and respect, and it was the first time he didn't think about escape. There was nothing left driving him to it. No cold, no injustice, no cruelty. After 14 years in 1961, he was released. Shiratori stepped back to the world, not as a fugitive from justice, but as a man who had finally attained his freedom. He returned to Amori, where his story had begun, and he had lived out the rest of his life in a quiet place with his daughter, the only family he had left. Thanks to his legendary escapes, he became a symbol. His name was mentioned in Japan alongside those of heroes, a man whom prison bars could not hold, whom torture could not break. He escaped from 4 prisons, but in the end, he triumphed with his dignity intact. So what do you think, guys? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet. See you in the next one.